Miley, who will give us our wonderful talk, and also Nancy Davis for funding.
Thank you very much. Okay, what I want to do today is talk a little bit about what I think are the main contributions of Juan Linz to the field of social science generally, political sociology in particular, democratic theory, empirical democratic theory, empirical political sociology was a normative concept as well, most particularly. So, to give you guys a bit of an overview of a variety of different debates that he generated and participated in over the years, and they remain, I think, very relevant for political debates that are increasingly salient and always salient in contemporary Spanish scene. So we'll talk about his continuing relevance, if you will. Let me say before I get into that, my relationship with him, as was mentioned, I'm originally from California. I went to UCLA when I was as an undergraduate, and they have an education abroad program. So I spent my junior year as an undergraduate in Barcelona. Really loved the city. Really was fascinated with politics, particularly language politics. I came from California, where there was all kinds of conflicts over bilingualism in schools, which was associated with migration politics. And was very interested in very different kinds of dynamics of political significance of language policy in schools originally. So I was had that lived experience in Barcelona, but then I lived there some more after I graduated. I was a real lover of the city and of all things Spanish. So when I went to graduate school, I got to graduate school at Yale. My undergraduate education was mostly democratic political theory. I was very interested in democratic theory, political philosophy, these sorts of things. I came across Juan Linz, who was also interested in many of those things and was a very prominent scholar of, among other things we'll talk about, nationalism in Spain. And so I became closer and closer with him as I became so impressed with the massive amount of erudition that the man had, combined with, on the other hand, the generosity he had with his time, and both he and his wife Gracia, who didn't have children of their own, and they took in students basically in a way that is very uncommon, let's say. And so, I had a very, very close personal relationship with him. Then over the years was he was obviously the advisor on dissertation, but then I ended up getting, because I was one of his last students, he was getting ready to retire when I came. I ended up getting involved in as co-editor of his collective works, which were published by the Centro de Política Sociology. And in fact, I got a postdoc to work in Madrid, the Centro de Política, during José directorship of the institution, largely, I think, because of this project. So I ended up continuing to learn from Juan basically until the very end, because the 7th volume was published. The last 4 volumes actually came out just a few weeks before he passed away. So we ended up celebrating the thing at the same time as we were basically mourning his death. So anyhow, so that's how I expertise Juan Linz, and also obviously goes without saying, it's a major impact on the way that I think about politics. Not that I agree with him on everything, but I think he's a very profound thinker. I think even when you disagree with him, thinking through the way he frames problems and thinking against him, and trying to think with him, if you will. It is, I think, an important, is a very fruitful thing, and I think he has had a massive impact in the way that people conceive of and thought about
tyrannical regime, the transition to democracy, the breakdown of democracy, and so he remains relevant in terms of the way in which, in terms of political debate in Spain as well. So let me talk about, go into his background. This is, of course, he was born in Germany, and it goes without saying he's one of the foremost political sociologists of the 20th century, and obviously Spanish political science. But he's not exactly your typically born in Germany in 1926, father German, mother Spanish, and amongst his first memories was the trauma of the breakdown of the Weimar Republic, the rise of Nazi Germany, and his mother and him moved back to Spain, into Spain in the spring of 1936. His father stayed behind, was killed by a drunk driver. But anyhow, so he arrived with his mother on the scene right before the break, the outbreak of civil war in Spain in 1936. So, and these traumatic experiences that he lived very closely in his youth really marked so much of his political obsessions and passions, and his sensibility, his kind of tragic sensibility on the one hand, and a real concern about the fragility of democratic institutions. So I think it's really important to understand, and with his passing, we've seen the passing in the last decade or so. So many people like him who were so marked by this experience of interwar Europe, lived experiences in interwar Europe, and as they pass, I think a certain kind of thinking about the values of democratic institutions. This is passing as well. All kinds of crises that we have with the legitimacy of democratic institutions in contemporary era. So we'll talk about that later when we get to that. So let me just give a brief overview. So like I said, he has this dual national cultural baggage, though he ends up identifying very strongly as Hispanic. And this is related to his education in Spain. But he was educated, but nevertheless, he's considered in national circles as perhaps the greatest late 20th century, second half of the 20th century figure in the Hegelian tradition. So Max Weber, the great German sociologist, was always sort of his number one guiding light, alongside with. But he was educated in 1950s, 1940s Spain originally, and in fact his mentor was Francisco Javier Conde, who was the director of the Instituto de Estudios Políticos. Very interesting figure. And the relationship with him over time. It's an interesting story to tell about that. But he was extremely erudite figure, very much versed in German political and social thought, and already because Juan was a person who was fluent in German when he was in university, studying law, studying social science studies. He was asked quite frequently and ended up doing kind of comparisons where he's thinking about German politics versus Spanish politics. So this was something that was very knowledgeable of his German tradition, but at the same time educated in Spain. He goes to Columbia in the 1950s. Gets a grant, goes to Columbia in the 1950s, and is immersed in the sociological review of Columbia University in New York City in the 1950s, which is a real center, an intellectual center. Merton was there, one of the great sociologists of the time, Robert Merton. Lazarsfeld, another one of the guys who really was a pioneer of survey research and things like this. Robert Lind was there. A variety of different people who he studied very closely with. But he came on the scene when he arrived on the scene in 1950, considered to be just an unbelievably erudite figure who knew everything about American history. Part of this being related to his mother was a very educated person, and he also also had a tutor, a personal tutor who was, interestingly, he was an Estonian anarchist who was a person without a passport who ended up in Franco, Spain, and was extremely erudite guy. He was his personal tutor. European education of European intellectuals that was not common, for example. He arrived on the scene and was immediately valued by people on the scene as this
incredibly erudite intellectual from Spain, but he was immersed into this very different political culture as well, and he ended up, he worked with Seymour Martin Lipset, who, one of the most famous political sociologists, man, the social basis of politics in the 1960s. Linz was his research assistant, and they actually produced manuscripts together, and a bunch of what is being condensed in this, as Lipset recognizes in the process comes from this collaboration really with Juan already. So you have other figures that are really important to Seymour Martin Lipset in individuals, the great theorist of political parties, was someone who was very influential on one and reflects on these themes about the difficulties and dilemmas of representative democracy. Gracia over here, one of the very famous social theorists, thinking about economic voluntary interaction, but also particularly in Juan's thought, the question of equilibration and dynamic processes of this comes through Pareto optic. Another person who's very influential. José is another great political theorist, European, who ended up also in the United States, and a theorist of democracy that was who someone Juan was always thinking with and against, among other things. On the other hand, you have Albert Hirschman, who was a really famous economist, who had a personal relationship with Juan, but also was very influential in the forging way that Juan thought about some things about how uneven development, uneven economic development is related to the generation of kind of regional kind of pride, thinking about that in terms of the evolution of Catalan nationalism. But in terms of that, thinking about the national question of Spain and the longer issues, really very interestingly, Juan was read early and was very influenced by Campo's work on the subject. The great leader, the Catalan leader, conservative leader, on the one hand, and on the other hand, Vicente Neves was someone who he met personally in the 1960s when he was doing some research, which I'll talk a little bit more. So this is kind of a sense of, these are some of the main thinkers with whom Juan is associated with in this tradition in which he pushes forward for understanding that. Now, what his main contributions to comparative politics, political sociology, and democratic theory are, I'll go through what I think are basically 5 of them, and hopefully we'll have time to go over the gist of them and we can open things up for you guys to talk about things that you might be more or less interested in. But it's got work on, as we have the 7 volumes here, and the 7th are a good way to the first volume is on fascism, as a major scholar of fascism. The second volume on nación, estado y lengua, nation, state, and language. The third on sistemas totalitarios and regímenes totalitarios, types of political regimes. The fourth on democracia, quiebres, transiciones y retos. I don't know if we talk about this, but for those who are interested, I think some of the other stuff that he has, we have in the 5th is economía y empresarios en España. He has something from the 1960s. He did so much work, so much empirical work, really thinking about what the relationship between business class and the Franco regime was, and stuff that just hasn't been taken advantage of by the historians of the Franco period yet. And also already getting involved as well in mentality, economic ideologies in Spain, all the way going back from early on up until more recently. The sixth volume on Partidos y Élites Políticas en España. So political elites and political elites and the parties, politics and party system. And the seventh on Historia Social en España. So he also has a variety of different historical analyses of and overviews of quantitative history, quantitative history, all kinds of really interesting stuff that are about the trajectory. As you see, the vast array of his work. But he's known internationally mostly for his contributions to the theory of democracy. Okay, in the first instance, he came on the scene, became famous for his work on the Franco regime, theorizing it as an authoritarian regime. This became a very influential theory, and it has also been debated. We talk about in terms of that debate on the one hand, and then from that he developed a broader, comprehensive, systematic, if you will, overview of types of regimes throughout the world that was then published in the 1970s. So the authoritarian regime piece comes out in 1964, of course, is when it first comes out. So he's, at first, even though he did his dissertation actually on the social basis of support for democracy in post-war Germany, using all kinds of survey data, secondary analysis of survey data. Nevertheless, he became famous in international circles in the 1960s for this. And then in the 1970s, he turns his attention to the question of the breakdown of democratic institutions. And has a very crucial and famous essay on the breakdown of democracy in Spain, but also has an introduction to this four-volume edited work with Al Stefan, including a very important volume on the breakdown of democracy in Chile by Arturo Valenzuela. Another volume edited with breakdowns in Latin America in the 1970s. So always from the 70s forward that you really see begins to really talk about, and already in the 60s, thinking about the most relevant political phenomena and problems of the day. Out of the breakdown project, then he became and is mostly known perhaps in Latin America for his critique of presidentialism. Which comes out of his analysis of the breakdown of democracy, and then in the 1990s he announced that another extremely influential book on the transitions to democracy, problems of democratic transition, economic consolidation, and again Spain is going to be very much at the center of Juan's concerns of thinking about the subject, but nevertheless goes in a very broad and systematic way. Through that. So anyhow, okay. So those are the and I want to talk a little bit about what each of these contributions is, and then go over maybe more quickly, and then go back in more depth, depending on what you guys are more or less interested in. So some of the things that he developed. So let me just talk about what the first contribution is. The typology of political regimes. So like I said, it makes sense that this is something that Juan distinguished himself up with. Think about how he had this unique upbringing, having been born in Germany, witnessed the breakdown of Weimar, and then being Spanish, always thinking about this comparison between the breakdown of Weimar and the breakdown of Spain, and the nature of National Socialism, and the nature of Franquism. So he famously defined the Franco regime as an authoritarian regime, which he distinguished from a totalitarian regime like the National Socialists. And he's thinking mostly about the National Socialists in Germany, but also Mussolini's fascism in Italy. And he distinguishes it from this regime in the first instance, and builds a broader typology based on one, its limited pluralism. Two, he distinguishes it, says that authoritarian regimes are characterized more by dominant mentality at most, but lower levels of ideology. So here he relies on this distinction made by this guy Theodor Geiger between mentality and ideology. The third point having to do with the question of mobilization. Mobilization versus demobilization as an emphasis of politics. And the fourth being the relationship between the party and the state.
So both related to the fact that both Hitler, for example, and Mussolini, crucially, they're leaders of these extremist political parties who come to power as opposed to Franco, who was a military general. Different kind of relationship between the role of the military party and state. Note in this definition, terror is not a different criteria for distinguishing regimes. And he talks about and he engages this question of the relationship between terror and autocracy, different forms of autocracy. So the famous definition of authoritarian regimes that he comes up with is that there are political systems with limited, not responsible political pluralism, without elaborate and guiding ideology, but with distinctive mentalities, without intensive or extensive political mobilization, except at some points of their development, and in which a leader or occasionally a small group exercises power within formally ill-defined limits, but actually quite predictable ones. Okay, so that's the definition. And this then, every point has been subject to much controversy and discussion about this, and we can talk about the nature of the different arguments and how he responds to them. But related contributions to this typology of political regimes, that where you have this authoritarian regime that later, and like I say, the distinction is, it works mostly, what wants to be mostly the distinction between let's say, a regime like Franco's regime and a regime like Mussolini's Italy, different kinds of right-wing dictatorships, right? And though the term totalitarianism also is used for the Soviet Union, for the communist world, and Juan uses that, but it's always, but Juan's familiarity with the Soviet world was always more circumscribed than it was obviously with the Germany, Italy, and Spanish cases, which he used so closely in his thinking. But nevertheless, so the totalitarianism versus authoritarianism versus comes up with another type of regime, sultanistic regimes, and then later develops what he calls a post-totalitarian regime, after he thought that the dynamics in the communist world have changed fundamentally. He started talking about post-totalitarianism being related to the long-term legacies of totalitarianism. This was very influential and turned into this book, Totalitarian and Authoritarian Regimes, which is originally an article which was like hundreds of pages long article, chapter in the book, and it was a book that had all of the sort of encyclopedia of the social sciences and talking about democracy. And they gave one chapter to non-democracies. And so we had to deal with everything that wasn't a democracy. But anyhow, so he really develops it up. And related contributions that are still very relevant and salient in Spain has to do with the broader sociology of Franquism that Juan engaged in. So I already mentioned his work from the 1960s on Los Empresarios ante el Poder Público, which really documents the political idea, sort of the relationship between, the perceptions of the relationship between the business class and the Franco regime at a very crucial moment in Spanish history. These interviews were being taken place in 1959, 1960, which is right at the IMF was intervening in 1959, and we got the whole turnaround of the Franco's political economy. So it's a crucial moment, and something that I urge people who are interested in Spanish history to take a look at. This is really good evidence about what was going on at the time, relationship between the state and the ruling class, so to speak. How to think of that. What is the relationship between the economic power and the political power at that time? So the role of businessmen. But not only was he also was engaged in preparing the first survey of Spanish youth, which was in the 1960s, and they asked all kinds of really interesting questions about political identity and things like this. And this then has been repeated. It was repeated. He was also involved in 1984 with all kinds of really interesting stuff about national identity amongst youth in Barcelona, in Catalonia, the Basque Country in the 1980s. So, but already in the 1960s, doing the sociology of Spanish society, and then also got very much interested in the evolution of the regime, because he was pushed on this. People said this is a very static picture of the regime, how's it moving? And so really getting into the evolution of the movimiento over time, and and then the comparative study of fascist movements as well. He's made major contributions in in his way of thinking about the authoritarianism, he was also, this line of research was also very influential in Latin America because of the right-wing dictatorships of the 1960s. How do we think about these right-wing dictatorships in the 1960s and 70s, the 1970s, mostly, basically. How do we think about this authoritarian turn? And in fact, through his close collaborator Al Stefan, who first became close with Juan when Juan was at Columbia in the 1960s, taking classes with him, he wrote a dissertation on military politics and was very familiar with Brazilian politics. And he ended up actually having intervention in Brazilian politics after talking to the Brazilian military general, saying this is a situation that it's not, the conditions aren't there for the consolidation of a legitimate regime here. So distinguishing between an authoritarian regime and an authoritarian situation, that actually he has a close relationship with Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was also around Colombia in the 1960s, and Cardoso talks about this as well, this ability to convince military people that the best thing to do is to stand down, and actually end up intervening somewhat in those developments. So the distinction between authoritarian regime and authoritarian situation is really important, and that's also related to the distinction between legitimacy and so this is the importance of legitimacy and formulas of legitimation that basically one of the arguments that's made to these military, when Franco first consolidated regimes was in a very different period in which sort of fascist ideology played kind of the role nowadays that you can't. And so they're fighting against maybe a few goods, but something along those lines. Anyhow, so this distinction between legitimacy and ethics, and that's important throughout his thoughts. We can go back to this, how he distinguishes the regimes, distinguishes the regimes along, but you can't really see this here, unfortunately. Charlie did it on there. But distinguishes pluralism, ideology, motion, and leadership. And along all these dimensions, the different types of regimes are characterized by different kinds of dynamics. So that's the first contribution to thinking about political regimes and types of political regimes, which is one of the great tasks of political science from the time of Aristotle forward. And in the 20th century, he's conceived as the authority of regime type and a regime type analysis. And you'll see that this thinking about regime types is something that never goes away from him. Particularly, it influences greatly his analysis of transitions to democracy, thinking about the paths of transition, the legacy of the prior regime type in influencing dynamics. But before we get to that, the second major contribution is conceived of in terms of the comparative analysis of the process of democratic breakdown, which I mentioned already. Now, and the themes that he develops in there. In that analysis, later became much more mainstream, but at the time much more assumed by mainstream political scientists. But his analysis of democratic breakdown was at a time when sociology was very influenced by structuralist kinds of interpretations. Barrington Moore had a very famous book around the time about democracy, dictatorship, and fascism, most talking about this kind of sociological determination of political outcomes that goes back centuries. But the idea that motivated Linz's analysis of democratic breakdown of the Republic of Spain, breakdown of Weimar in particular, breakdown of the democracies in Latin America, was a sense that these were not, the breakdowns were not necessary. There was a contingency, political factors, political errors were made, that it didn't have to be. And in he was very fond of quoting, did so on multiple occasions, the great German historian Friedrich Meinecke, who reflecting upon the breakdown of the Weimar Republic, said, "I said to myself with the deepest consternation, not only that the day of misfortune of the first order had gone for Germany, but also this was not necessary. Here existed no pressing political or historical necessity, such as had led to the downfall of Wilhelm II in the autumn of 1918. Here it was no general tendency, but something like a chance, specifically Hindenburg's weakness, that had turned the scales. So the sense that this tragedy unfolds, and then it unfolds in a way that could have been avoided, is something that really drives his analysis, trying to think about what happened in Spain, what happened, or what happens more generally. And so there's a stress on contingent elements and political factors in what is conceived of as a dynamic process of polarization and breakdown. And here the work of Pareto, as I said, is important in the way that he thinks of this. And related to this project of democratic breakdown, growing out of it is this criticism of presidentialism, because he sees it as being overly rigid system, and a system that introduces full democratic legitimacy, where you can have a Congress, if you will, that has one kind of democratic mandate, and a president that has another kind of democratic mandate. And he thinks this is actually can be explosive when there's a political crisis and both sides can claim legitimation. In fact, this is something that grows out of his, and it plays a factor in, for example, Storch's analysis of the breakdown in Chile in the 1970s. So it grows out of it, and it also, to the end of his days, he pushed on this criticism of presidentialism. He started really talking more about what he thought were many of the atrocities of the quality of democracy in the United States, relating back to political institutions, institutional design in the United States, in particular presidentialism. So in this, he accompanied his friend and colleague Robert Dahl, who was also highly critical of the American Constitution. Wrote a good book called "How Democratic Is the American Constitution?" attacking the conception, the secularized conception of the Constitution and the way that democracy works in the United States. Anyhow, so criticism of presidentialism was something that was then again very, very has been very influential in the literature of political science. Huge debate about whether or not what are the virtues of parliamentalism versus presidentialism, virtues of crisis related to this. This was originally a footnote in this discussion of crisis, or an excursus in the discussion of the crisis and breakdown. And it was in his analysis of what happened in Spain, the fact that there was a kind of semi-presidentialism. There was some presidentialism, or the semi-presidential system during the Republic, and this was related to some of the political mistakes that were made. So he thought about that. It came back again and again. One of the things with themes in this is thought is they're intertwined to begin with, and he returns to them again and again all the time. So this is part of the way that he worked, if you will. Now the themes in his particular analysis of the breakdown of democracy is themes of legitimacy, particularly loyalty, disloyalty, and semi-loyalty. Things that he sort of divides political actors into these three camps, which is against a prominent thesis of thinking about the 1930s in particular as a thesis of democracy versus the enemies of democracy. In fact, in his account, the real culprits, are actually sort of people of the center who are semi-loyal and end up turning against the regime, polarizing, leading or succumbing to polarizing tendencies. And then also into his analysis of these dynamic processes of political polarization that we need to break down is the possibility for a re-equilibration. So these processes can heat up, and you can see polarization, but you can see with kind of effective leadership how things can be re-equilibrated. And in that, his experiences actually traveling back to Spain and spent time in the court of France in 1958 when all this stuff was going on around De Gaulle, and actually watched the way that there was a re-equilibration. So things about this Pareto theme about equilibrium, re-equilibration is something that he works through his account, thinking about ways in which this, you see this sort of train going forward towards a catastrophe, what are the moments that this catastrophe can be avoided. And then, in particular, in his account, he talks about the specifics of this and the influence of this particular account on the historiography of the Second Republic of Spain, because he was very influential, both as an advisor of Stanley Payne, who was a conservative, very prominent conservative kind of take on the Second Republic, but also Edward Malfegas, who's one of the dominant sort of left-wing interpretations. Oversimplified to think about it just in terms of that. Nevertheless, very, very influential in particulars. But the theme of throughout is the role of political leaders and intellectuals in the creation of what he considers to be unsolvable problems. And so this notion of unsolvable problems, I think, is a really interesting notion, and it's something that is really marks Linz's contribution to the major thinkers of democracy. And keep in mind that he's someone who's in dialogue from the 1970s forward. He's at Yale with Robert Dahl. Robert Dahl is probably the most prominent North American democratic theorist of the 20th century. And around Dahl, there's also Charles Lindblom is there, Robert Lane, very, very prominent democratic theorists. And so he's in constant dialogue with these people. And this notion of unsolvable problem, going back to this idea that thinkers can create, intellectuals can create an unsolvable problem, is something that he will go back to again and again. So let me just show this, what we think of, what he thinks of what an unsolvable problem is. We got a couple of quotes from him, and then a way that he's talked about unsolvable problems towards the end of his life. So he says, how does it happen that regimes come to face problems that are unsolvable, or at least perceived as such by a majority? There are many reasons, and it would be presumptuous to attempt to analyze them here in detail. Some are structural problems that perhaps no regime can solve. Others might concede the capacity of a regime trying not to compromise democratic freedoms and processes. Might supersede. Still others might simply become unsolvable because of the way in which the democratic leadership has formulated them and its ability to implement certain solutions or overcome certain constraints that should not be inscrutable. In societies, particularly European societies, in which democratic regimes gained considerable stability, relatively few problems were of the structural type. Many of the difficulties arose following the decisions by the democratic leadership that made solutions within the democratic framework impossible. Oversimplifying somewhat, we can say that a regime's unsolvable problems are often the work of its elites. So that's a formulation that he has in the 1970s. Now, this is a formulation that he gave me that's really interesting, and it shows so much about how Juan was as a person. This was after he had been having serious health problems, and he was in his early 80s at the time when he was talking to me, and he'd been going to the doctor and things like this. And rather than getting all depressed about this, about the approaching of death, he thought about his conversations with doctors and went back to this idea of an unsolvable problem. So this is something he said. If today doctors speak of incurable and chronic diseases, why can't we as political scientists do the same? Perhaps the root of this reticence can be traced back to Auguste Comte, with his maxim to know so as to foresee, so as to provide for. Some problems are unsolvable because of the level of economic interdependence in today's world. Others are unsolvable for reasons of political will. Other times, even though solutions do exist, they are incompatible with the convictions and values of actors and limitations imposed by institutional legitimities. And so long as these are respected, the problem has no solution. An analyst should denounce the false promises of the politicians. For example, when candidates in primary elections promise that if they are elected, the factory jobs in Michigan will return, some analysts should raise his voice and say, please don't lie. Or like in Iraq, once the invasion had been decided, how could a disaster have been avoided? The only way would have been to send sufficient soldiers on the country, but such a solution is obviously unviable because of the lack of will to reinstitute the draft or obligatory military service. Politicians and analysts falsify when they don't take into account political viability, and this is how they generate false hopes and thereby produce unsolvable problems and create disasters. So this concern, he's looking at this, and so this is something that is not just about the disaster of the breakdown of democracy, but also can be his criticism of what was going on in the United States in the last decade of his life, which he was very concerned about the quality of democracy. But let me turn to think about, to say a little bit more about what, how Linz conceived of democracy, and what was the sort of moment of force, I think, behind his advocacy of a certain kind of democracy. And I think of it as, regardless of your own personal politics, and my personal politics are somewhat different from Linz on some issues, but particularly with respect to thinking about the relationship between democracy and capitalism, because of his youth and upbringing, he was very opposed to sort of Marxism, although he was also quite close with particular Marxist people like etc. But nevertheless, I think anyone who has, whether or not you have revolutionary politics or progressive politics or conservative politics or what they be, to think through his espousal, his arguments for a kind of more conservative brand of democracy, I think is a good moral and political exercise. So to begin with is this idea, and he liked to quote this guy, Burkhardt, who says, beware of the terrible simplifiers. So he's always worried about this issue of demagoguery, if you will. And behind this is a kind of this notion that he never quoted it, but I think it is indicative of a certain sentiment, which was Machiavelli well expressed when he said, "It ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things." Okay, so this idea of the difficulty of overcoming the established status quo, and the quote goes on. Unfortunately, it's not there. The quote goes on to say, because the people who have everything to lose, they also have lots of power, and so it's a very dangerous situation to pull people up. So as Linz puts it, reflects, I think, in this Machiavellian pessimistic tone. The radical critic of the existing social order, or for that matter, cultural or religious order, might maintain that if in the short run democracy cannot serve as an instrument for decisive change, it does not deserve his loyalty. What he might not realize is that the alternative is not revolutionary change imposed in authoritarian fashion, but the reversal of slow processes of change under conditions of freedom and compromise by counter-revolutionary authoritarian rule. This is something he talked about in the breakdown of democratic machines. And he goes further in a footnote to say,
obviously there will be those who sincerely feel that other values rank higher. Certainly in the face of poverty, inequality, economic stagnation, and national dependency of foreign powers by democratic rulers. For example, the Weimar politicians accepting with reservations Erfahrungspolitik, I don't know how I probably butchered that. Such a response is understandable. However, those who think this way should be very sure that the non-electoral struggle are in their favor. They should remember that for each successful revolution there have been more victorious counter-revolutions that have represented not only the maintenance of the status quo, but already made a terrible cost for those advocating such changes.
Jeff, before you switch the slide, how did he apply all of this thinking, which he said he was doing in the kind of 70s and 80s, to more recent developments in Spain and Europe, with the kind of Occupy movements and the all the critiques of democracy today?
We can talk about that some more because I think let me just go through and finish the way he thinks about it, because he definitely was on the side of representative democracy. And against what he thought was a certain kind of anti-politics built into direct democracy and calls for direct democracy. But nevertheless was also very concerned and understood that there are real reasons behind disaffection, disenchantment with representative institutions, having to do with the quality of political leadership. And so what's going on inside political parties, what's going on with respect to how political parties get representatives and all this. So very worried about what he thought was the crisis of the quality of democracy. But at the same time, he was always very concerned about the fragility of those representative institutions and freedom of the security.
But we'll get back to it a little bit more when I go. So the third contribution is to the analysis of transitions. In Spain, throughout the time of the transition, as I said already in the 1960s, putting on all the empirical social science, survey research, all this sort of stuff, he was at the inception of that. Spain, and with the Fundación Fuerza, he and his colleagues of his, and they have this company called DACA. They did massive systematic study of public opinion at the time of the transition to democracy, which again, being a serious historian who wants to understand what's going on, you got to look at this. You got to look at these volumes. They're indispensable volumes, and he was behind that. He was also related to that behind the analysis of the party system in Spain, the transition to democracy, the demise of the the rise and of the Socialist Party and the It's all that analyzed with the social basis of support, using survey research at the time, and also thinking very much the politics of the Constitution. And we'll get the question of nationalism, how that was dealt in the Spanish case. But more generally, this question of transition to democracy, as he was sort of on this wave of this democratic, this wave of democratic breakdowns in the 1970s. He would, when he out with this world step on breakdown, his work on transitions to democracy really begins thinking about Spain, and he's in Spain at the time. Has a couple of years actually following developments, going to all party Congress meetings, going to the meeting, watching the whole process very up front. He never wrote, originally was going to write a big book on the transition. He never wrote a big book on the transition. He was behind all this other stuff and wrote many things. But he ended up writing with Stefan what I think is widely considered perhaps the definitive book on transitions to democracy. It's definitive, but one of the most influential books, no doubt, on problems of democratic transition and consolidation, more generally, but with a very important chapter on transition in Spain. In the work with Stefan, this is co-authored with Stefan as well, and the way they work together it was very unique as well. But nevertheless, they thematize the question, they revisit democratization, they go back into the nature of the political regime that they're transitioning from, and the different dimensions of political society, economic society, civil society, state, bureaucracy, all sorts of issues, and they go through this and then chart out from different regime-type beginnings, transition paths and transition paths. Different tasks that different kinds of regime are going to face, and why it's going to be more difficult, for example, for the post-totalitarian regimes than it would be for these, what he's considering these authoritarian regimes to transition to represent. Related to the question of having a relatively meritocratic non-political
something close to the rule of law, which again is a very contentious subject. As composition and leadership of the preceding non-democratic regimes, really thinking about the ways in which, and in this vein, along with Schmitter, O'Donnell, Schmidt, or thinking about the reformists in the opposition, reformists in the regime coming together, and how that process looking at the Spanish case was very paradigmatic of that. I'm thinking about the reforma Pactada, as they call it. And at the time, and also thinking about the political economy of legitimacy and coercion, what's the relationship between legitimacy and economic developments. One of the big differences with transition in East of Europe, we're having a massive privatization of everything. People's lives are spiraling out from under them, and so the relationship between those kinds of worsening economic conditions and the likelihood of prospects of better transition. And then also really focusing in on constitution-making environments and politics, particularly this idea that what you want to do is you want to try to get a constitution that brings in as many, as broad elements of society as possible. So you want to kind of have a kind of lowest common denominator that everyone can agree to. So thinking about the politics of that, very different kind of way of thinking about it, for facilitating a smooth transition, as opposed to kind of purging politics. Thinking about that, and then as well the question of stateness, the relationship between stateness, nationalism, and democratization. And really thinking about this as and the ways in which the politics of democratization can engender dangerous and polarizing, hopeful, accommodating outcomes. So the fourth contribution then is the study of nationalism, related to this. It grows out of and comes from before already the stuff on democratic transition. And in this crucial in this analysis, the distinction between state and nation. And this is something that he began to develop in the 1970s. A very important book, a long article called Early State Building and Late Peripheral Nationalisms in Spain, where he talked about this process of state building and the relationship between this long process of state building and then the different nationalist awakenings, if you will. And so this came out in 1973 before Franco's death. And in that article, he very famously defined Spain along these more national terms in a way that would be very influential in the way people come to think about the Estados Unidos. So he says, Spain is for most Spaniards a nation state, invoking in them a sense of solidarity that no other group affiliation produces. For important minorities, it has been and is likely to remain only a state with whose authority they comply in their behavior, attributing to it more or less legitimacy, depending on their attitudes towards the regimes exercising power within Spain's border and the coercive capacities of those regimes. For those minorities, Spain is a state, but not their nation, and therefore not a nation state. So this is something that he comes to formulation, and this then is related to this intuition, this insight is then related to his personal implication in really generating very, very high level research, survey research data, public opinion data on how people feel about national identity in Spain. And so you can watch this as well from the time of the transition to now. You can look at how different social sectors and population, different kinds of identification emerge and how this has evolved. And this is all behind, so Linz is behind all of that. And that's, I think, one of the things that distinguishes Spain and makes it a great place to study nationalism. This massive abundance of sociological data that we have on the process of nation building and nationalist awakening that's been going on since the transition to democracy, at least. Along those lines, Conflicto en Euskadi was a book that in the 1980s, came out early 80s, really charting the Basque Country, understanding it as in part a conflict between us, and looking at and doing a real systematic and thorough analysis of the social basis of different positions in the Basque Country. Along that, then he wrote a very important article that came out in English as well, as part of this, which was the distinguishing between what he called primordialism and nationalism, really thinking about the ways in which the more radical nationalists, about the Suna type people linked to the Izquierda out of Chile, how they have very different understandings of the vast nation than the more moderate vast nationalists of the PNB are more likely to have an essentialist kind of ethnic, sort of explicitly ethnic understanding, whereas there was a very different kind of nationalist project associated with the more radical national thinking about that. I think that's a very important contribution. Then related to this is thinking about institutional design for coping with these kinds of nationalist conflicts and accommodating them in a democratic setting in a way that doesn't need the democratic breakdown as it has in many places. So thinking about particularly federal and quasi-associational kinds of setups for multinational accommodation, for accommodating different kinds of national sentiments within a common democratic framework. So this, written in 1973, and this was something that is not important to make people talk about Linz as if he was obviously on the Spanish national side, or something that sort of understood all this kind of Spanish nationalism. But it seems like people like Julian Marias is very dangerously friendly to the nationalists, like I said, it was very influenced by people like Juan J in his understanding of the situation. Speaking Spaniards, this is 1973, will have to give up the idea of a Spanish nation and decentralized multilingual state. In exchange, the periphery, while enjoying a new sense of nationhood, will have to combine it with the loyalty to the multinational that he thought was the compromise that could lead to kind of democratic stability. And that's not something that goes back to the 1970s. It's in the discussion about state democratization. And then the last really important book that came out with Alcet and also Vendor from India, thinking about state nations. So distinguishing state nation, the state nation idea versus the nation state idea. So the nation is a kind of idea really strongly tries to promote a dominant language, dominant culture in a particular territory. And he wants to distinguish between kind of state nation approach, which is associated with federal associations. So what do they mean by this? State nation policies stand for a political and institutional approach that respects and protects multiple but complementary socio-cultural entities. State nation policies recognize the legitimate public and even political expression of active socio-cultural cleavages, and they include mechanisms to accommodate competing claims made on behalf of those divisions without imposing or privileging in a discriminatory way any one claim. State nation policies involve crafting a sense of belonging, or we feeling, with respect to the statewide political community, while simultaneously creating institutional safeguards for respecting and protecting politically salient sociocultural diversities. The we feeling may take the form of defining a tradition, history, and shared culture in an inclusive manner with attachment to common symbols of the state, or of inculcating some form of constitutional patriotism. In democratic societies, the institutional safeguards constituted of state-nation policies most likely take the form of federalism, often specifically asymmetrical federalism, or consociational practice. And he thought, to get back to the Spanish case, he thought that the Spanish constitutional framework of the Estados Unidos more or less embodied this kind of state-nation approach. And talked about this in the literature on transition, that some of the things that were so crucial to forging a successful transition in Spain was the way in which at the Constitution, during the Constitution making process, the sort of they managed to kind of square a circle in a certain sense when thinking about this issue. On the one hand, they, in terms of being able to incorporate obviously a kind of Spanish right with an understanding of Spain as the nation state. On the one hand, powerful group in Spanish society, obviously, and on the other hand, national liberty.
understand and aspire for an increasingly national culture, if not
more and more self-government as well. So the sovereignty question is in the Spanish Constitution. Is national sovereignty belongs to the Spanish people, from whom all state powers emanate. So the demos is understood as Spain, is the Spanish people. Then Article 2 also says the Constitution is based on the indissoluble unity of the Spanish nation. Okay, so those are both appealing to the percentage of the population that conceives of Spain as its nation state. But on the other hand, and it says the common and indivisible homeland of all Spaniards. This indivisibility stuff is also in the French Constitution, also in the Americans. It's not only Spanish national state. But on the other hand, it recognizes and guarantees the rights of self-government of nationalities and regions of which it is imposed, and the solidarity amongst them all. So on the one hand, it guarantees indissoluble unity, but on the other hand, it's recognizing and guaranteeing this right to self-government. So guaranteeing that, if you will, that a minority, which can be a permanent minority on some issues, some important issues for them, they can be the local majority on the one hand. And on the other hand, obviously, we talked about other kinds of mechanisms, but that's a very important mechanism for seen and conceived of explicitly as a way of accommodating nationalist aspirations to a certain extent within a broader democratic framework. Related to that, then, is in Article 3, which the first article, 3.1, says that Castilian is the official Spanish language of the state. All Spaniards have the duty to know it and the right to use it. But on the other hand, it says the other Spanish languages shall also be official with respect to self-government communities. And the richness of the different linguistic modalities of Spain is a cultural heritage which shall be specially respected and protected. So those are massive transformations in the dominant culture of the political institutions coming from the Franco period in terms of what's legally being enshrined and promoted. Along with this, then, is the Article 137 and 147, which then allow for a spell out the decentralization process, which led to kind of quasi-federal situation. So in terms of this idea of the state nation, one way to think about it is, on the one hand, you have, at the time of the Spanish, thinking about the national question and how the national question was dealt with. On the one hand, you had people who were thinking and wanting a unitary Spanish nation state. A nation state understood in terms of state structures, central power, but also in terms of imagined communities, imaginations, national ideas, the ideas of who the people are, and all that, and what the nature of the collective is. So that's on the one side. On the other side, you have people who want an independent, let's say, here we have a Catalan nation state or a Basque nation state. And so you have these two camps, and the Constitution is, in a sense, to sort of accommodate both sides. So that's the basic idea behind it. And so it tries to accommodate in terms of devolving political power, but also particular kinds of political power over language, over educational system, over cultural ideals. Because this is what you've seen happen, even though there's all kinds of politics and fierce politics about how far you can go within this playing field, if you will, that's been mapped out by the Spanish constitutional order. This comes from a particular analysis that I'm developing, the contemporary situation going on in Catalonia. But nevertheless, that's the basic idea behind Linz's analysis. And then, with respect to this question of the Constitution, whether or not, so he thinks that the constitutional order is something that allowed for a massive amount of a very large degree of consensus across a very broad political spectrum of very opposed ideas, and thought of this as a good thing. Nevertheless, for those related to this, the rules of the game, they too can be changed, of course, in a referendum through Article 92, although this is obviously the Spanish Constitution as it comes from the central government. But you could also have a referendum on it. You could amend any part of the Constitution. Actually, Section 168 says that any part of the Constitution can be
amended. So you have a rule of law, constitutional order that allows for it would be very difficult for a referendum that then would allow for a secession constitutionally, unilateral secession. It would require a massive constitutional reform, but it's not impossible. So the rules of the game are difficult. It's difficult to get the touchdown, if you will. But nevertheless, it's also very difficult for these guys to get the touchdown. So that's given the difficulties in places that are multilingual, multicultural, and having a democratic convivencia. This is something to be an achievement, not to be dismissed lightly. Anyhow, so and related to this is, in terms of the rules of the game, he was very critical of, on the one hand, the self-determination as a utopia. And he thought of this in terms of the unitary nation state on the one hand, and the people desiring a unitary nation state of their own on the other are in a sense both linked together with this belief in self-determination, with the self is in both cases. And in terms of this idea of self-determination in the vast nexus of the conflicto neuscadi, he refers to this as utopia for the following reasons. It is a utopia in the sense that it proclaims the ideal of a community that can ignore the complex realities derived from almost a century of immigration and the differing strength of primordial ties within Catalan America, the vast community itself. As we know, ideologies and utopias can change the world, but they can also engender bitter conflicts, insoluble problems, so back to the unsolvable problem issue, and the threat to living and working together irrespective of identity, as Ivan, the former Yugoslav, you are quite well aware of, right? And so related to this then is what he thinks are some theoretical problems built into this ideology of self-determination, which is more and more becoming mainstream in Catalan society. And this was something that at the time of the transition was addressed and explicitly rejected. And so go back reasons why, it's theoretical reasons why this appeal to self-determination as a solution to nationalist conflicts and spreading this is a pipe dream, if you will. So it goes back to Ivor Jennings on this. Ivor Jennings, a very influential idea. The problem of the unit of government is particularly difficult because there is no certain solution. Nearly 40 years ago, a professor of political science, who was also president of the United States, President Wilson, never trusted political scientists, enunciated a doctrine which was ridiculous, but which was widely accepted as a sensible proposition. On the surface, it seemed reasonable. Let the people decide. It was in fact ridiculous because the people cannot decide until someone decides who are the people. Right? So this idea, and so this is related to this idea that Bob Dahl also thinks that this question of boundaries is something that is particularly difficult for democratic theory. And democratic theory actually presupposes that we know who the people are in some respects. Although we can talk about that, there are ways to think about borders within democratic theory, but they're notoriously difficult. And in particular, as well, this idea of a referendum for self-determination, or a plebiscite on self-determination, that this is going to be something that can solve problems rather than create problems, calling for this. And this is something he said in 2012 that came out. One of the most misleading and dangerous applications of the democratic principle is to say that plebiscite should decide on the claims of independence of nationalist movements. There are many arguments against this simplistic idea. One is the false analogy between an election and such a plebiscite. An election decides who shall govern pro tempore. While the plebiscitary decision is permanent, should the answer be affirmative, i.e. in favor of independence. Another, already noted by Ivor Jennings, is that the plebiscite presumes a prior non-democratic decision of who should decide the population eligible. In Jennings' words, and he repeats that, the argument that the people should decide in the plebiscite presumes as well additional prior decisions about the minimal levels of participation and proportion of votes required. Given our knowledge of public opinion, there is no veil of ignorance, and therefore parties' acceptance of the plebiscite is based on their prior knowledge about popular preferences. So this is, for example, evident in what's happening in this country, where Cameron was looking at the polls, and even though he might be surprised that they were 33% in the polls, he's thinking, they'll call it right now. So it's sort of this idea. even more dramatic and often traumatic are the social and human consequences of forcing people to make a choice between dichotomous alternatives that ignore that history and social interactions have created different degrees of dual identities and social ties. Al Stepai and I have devoted much effort to analyze dual identities and how state nations rather than nation states are compatible with them, and how federalism is a better solution than democratic choice and plebiscites. Plebiscites may be useful for deciding the fate of smaller areas, particularly border communities, but not of large political units. So that's his take on the democratic credentials of the plebiscite.
Now there's a fifth element. We're already getting to the influx. So I think I've said plenty in terms of his contributions to the relevant political debates in Spain. So with that, I guess, open up for some questions, or what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to start having drinks today?
We can have drinks.
Depends what we want.
Once I start drinking, and then while we talk, get a 5-minute break, do that, and then come back and we can drink and
Yeah,
talk.
we can do that. Yeah, that's a good idea.
In Scotland, it was a bit more complicated because it was the Westminster government that adamantly insisted on not having the third option, which was more devolution, because that would have won by a huge majority.
That's one of the things about surveys. Put 3 options or 5 options.
Usually
The middle option wins.
No, on this case, I think it's actually a bit more fundamentalism because it gives you benefits, but now the huge risks of what you see as risk. So, whereas this way, they could just say, well, we won, so, next 30 years, the question is
What do you think, Keaton?
Very, very interesting. I'm interested in solvable problems.
The idea of unsolvable problems.
These are very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, you have experience with your country as well, right? With some of the issues, right? So,
yeah.
what would you say about Crimea?
I think one of the things in Crimea that happened right before the invasion was the first thing that the Ukrainian new government did was to say that there was a official language, Russian official language.
At the state level, though, I think they were kind of saying we'll keep the region. No, I agree, but just, I don't know.
And their basic take is that the Ukrainian situation was always tenuous because it's very difficult to get them to agree for federal solution. But and there was very strong Ukrainian nationalism. So it's difficult for maintaining. Yeah. Not see how it wasn't.
What do you think of the question of nation states? What do you think of Israel?
Oh, well, he was very critical of it.
No, but solving the problem of having a
well, their argument would be for one state, multicultural, associational, maybe federal, binational.
Yes.
Very dangerous. That's for me? Oh, great. Did you want one? Sorry.
No, it's so fine.
Just check that it has a good battery.
It has, but I think it's better to save the computer than the battery.
Yes. Yes. But what you have is, in a sense, an emergence of a European state. It's information. It's not, and nations themselves, what do they want? They want to become states. So the states are, the state is changing, particularly with respect to its ability, the scope of issues that it can actually regulate. So, for example, Spain right now, it can't devalue. Right? So on the one hand, but on the other hand, obviously the struggle in Spain is certainly all about how much state power. Evolve more state power, give you more state power, only independent state power within, even though independence means less. So yeah, it's an interesting Oh yeah, well, I mean, the European Constitution,
the creation of a right now, you still have, it doesn't almost exist only at the level of the state, even though so much solid power. So there's this disjunct between the political sphere that operates entirely as a federal government. Well, but Hammond's got a referendum coming up on it. It's a very, very dangerous move. No, not the Scottish one. The Scottish one, I think, he's going to be okay with. But if they win the election, listen, they're going to do it. If they win the election, I'm going to hold the referendum to teach British law. And that they easily lose that. And we're on press. Yeah, that's what I want. We need an empty glass for them. Are they cheating? No cheats. I don't think he's going to win yet. Why don't you do it? If he wins, he has. If he wins, he's going to win. And the 40s are notoriously so he's made it a prominent policy. Talking about the referendum on Europe. Count Bob. I don't like that. But when the main possible for you guys to either some people go to the referendum or what it is. There's no point. Mostly. It'd be terrible. No, that's right. That's right. You gotta point that out. That's what the Southern countries have to become more confident like that. We have to also say, you know what? It's true that we have to do what we say. I guess it's true, but it's very hard to blow it and fuck up everyone. It's like a suicide bomb. That's right. Because of course you can something like that. Now there's like a normal law in the parties and there's so much what if there's been a beginning maybe one word but the baby was
didn't they just like send these other?
Yeah, I think he was very worried about that.
Yeah, 700.
Figure out really, it would always just again, I think that
that was a bit of a shocker when everything.
Yeah, in the American case, I think you began to compare to suspect that
No, it's not and these people,
but he lived so much of his life in a world where European welfare state was so consolidated.
The businessmen found it hard to believe that
so you're going to get 500 people with that.
and more generally, if you think of his whole concern is like what happens when the left rises up and it causes the right to crush them. And everyone's worse off. But now what we see is what happens when the right don't left, right? It's everybody.
But also when a certain side of the right, that's power, is really going to make capitals to lead so they fall. But the patients drop. Patients else, they didn't do it. What they did is but the system is
the same it is.
Yeah.
But I think that is a broader strategy. A short-term strategy is start with the funds, then it will everyone hates it. That's how what Thatcher did.
I don't know.
Maybe yeah. I think there are the corporate. I mean, you're right about corporate interests. All that stuff. Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. And on that, his analysis of the breakdown, the destruction of the Uche in the long term has such a negative impact on the dynamics of Spanish politics because if you think about the Uche was, it had this symbolic break. It had this symbolic break and it had this way of life. The fact that they paid empathy numbers that was on the right, it's not a coincidence. Both times that the Pepe has ruled with an absolute majority, the shit hit the fan. So, I think this is a real, and why did you say they collapsed? Why did you say they collapsed? I don't know. I think there was, I think it had, well, yeah, the Suarez is getting removed now, but the entire collapse of them, there was weird stuff about people, about personal politics around people not liking Suarez and the party. Very strange. Yeah. Should we try to reconvene and have some questions or people say? Should we try to reconvene and have some questions or better
leave this for once. Yeah, but there's been me, I'm sure you didn't have a bit of you were developed like America. Big revolutions like this guy.
Yeah, he was very skeptical of the job. He was always worried of breakdown. He might be right. It looks dangerous.
So what was the theory? Basically, if it relies too much on the power of
if you mobilize the popular sector against the establishment, it's better win.
Right.
Because otherwise it's down to the question.
Yeah, there was an article with a fail analysis of, I'll send you the link, where the author was arguing basically like many revolutionary, if you can call it, I mean it's not revolutionary, it's not revolution, but still regimes failed when challenged by the elites because they want to stick to democratic principles. And then they kind of avoid using the force to counter what the basic that he was arguing about. Basically, what there is a combination of elites and the capitalists. And as long as you can shy away from actually going to the police and the army, eventually it works. And he was kind of saying that now they've actually started arresting people and sending them to around the stuff. So he's hoping that this will work out. Like you said, for there. And like,
So you gotta take off.
When you go to the pub, I'll go to the left.
to get here.
Oh yeah? Oh cool. You come in for how long?
Coming until the 6th. I was like, there's always great food. It's very good because like there's an equal amount of food at any one time there. Here there are far fewer. Yeah, well, that's why I said don't feel bad anymore. Distributing once of it. Here he comes. Why is there a big document? I mean, why? Yeah, because if you have education in your language, you have BA and you have to take economic well, yeah,
usually underneath it all is the economic crisis, property so that part of well, it is the problem is part of the really want to understand. And it's related about what happened. They just make the argument they got the better work.
but in terms of work
great more than giving more. Oh yeah, there's this whole and so there's all that because this idea we're different because if we take the boards out A earlier, we're much less happy.
Well, we can't argue whether it's like or not, whether it's stuff.
Maybe through different work habits. And also as well as people and many people increasingly got jobs from a second job. You got to your kind of job.
So I supervised the chapter on German and Japanese.
treat Germans considered in general lazy, prone to emotions. Yeah. Like overjoyous.
I think I pointed out how
where did it come from in that time?
the Middle Ages, there was
well, I know there was a quote, but so what the argument is, of course, that the work ethic and the certainly work hard. You say you're going to the event, it's not what it's well, I would guess so, yeah. I mean, something else. But I think it's really different. No, it's just that I think partially, I guess, partially we'll disagree on although I guess his argument was the two generations were not. But then there are issues with adapting government models. Was actually adapting the government, for example, for Gracia. Those kind of related so that's exactly the same thing. Except when you go to Germany, it's hard. Actually, sometimes the German community so,